If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back.
That poem by Claude McKay was published in 1919, which is generally regarded as the beginning of what's called the Harlem Renaissance. A powerful, although relatively brief, literary and cultural movement typically associated with Harlem, although many of the primary figures, many of the people we associate with it, didn't actually live in Harlem. I begin with this poem because it sort of kicks off my this introductory unit on Harlem Renaissance poetry. And to give you a little context about when it was written, the year 1919, that was a tumultuous year in United States history, especially from the perspective of race relations. By October of 1919, there had been 38 different race riots in various cities and towns across the country. Over 40 black men were lynched in the first half of 1919, 8 more burned at the stake or dismembered. It was what was known during the summer as the Red Summer of 1919, an allusion to the violence and bloodshed that characterized the time. And I think that kind of racial violence is an important backdrop for this poem, but also for all of the poetry that we're going to read. I mean, one statistic that I'll give you now, though we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail later on, is that between 1889 and 1918, nearly 2,500 black men were lynched in the U.S., with very few of the attacks resulting in a conviction or really even a trial. Oftentimes these lynchings were hangings, though involved all kinds of grotesque torture first. It's against this backdrop and some of the response from black Americans that Claude McKay wrote this poem. And there are a few things I'd like to draw your attention to, and they're not just unique to this poem, but that I'm hoping will help you in your reading of all of the poems that we're going to read this week and in subsequent semesters. Now, the first is that, like most Harlem Renaissance poets, Claude McKay tended toward the well-known forms, the Western forms. In this case, the 14-line sonnet. Now, after we look at the poets like County Cullen, Claude McKay, and others who tended to gravitate towards the more conventional poetic forms that we typically associate with the Western tradition, the European tradition, then I'm going to take us to the folks like Langston Hughes and Sterling Brown, who drew on black expression, black music, for example, the spirituals and so forth. But I wanted to start here because this was the poetry that for a lot of people really characterized what the Harlem Renaissance was all about. I want to make sure we've got a couple of tools at our disposal, and one of the most basic, especially when you're talking about formal poetry like the sonnet, is rhyme scheme. And I'm assuming that some of you have had some exposure to this and that some of you may have not. And so very briefly, the way that you determine what the rhyme scheme of a poem is it's actually quite simple. Each new sound, new end sound, gets a different letter. So, if the first line of the poem ends in hogs, that sound, hogs, becomes A. At the end of the next line, the word spot does not rhyme with hogs, so that gets a new sound, B. But then we get dogs, and that does rhyme with hogs, so that goes back to A. And then we get lot, which does rhyme with spot, so that takes us back to B. And we follow that all the way through. What you'll notice here is that McKay employs a pretty standard sonnet rhyme scheme, which is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D. Now, after the 8th line, when you transition to the 9th one, that's oftentimes, not always, but often that signals what's called a turn. And that's when the poem often heads in, not in a new direction, but tends to address the topic perhaps from a slightly different perspective. It's where the poem transitions somehow. And that does exist here. I'll let you sort of find how that transition occurs. And then the last thing to notice in terms of rhyme scheme is that whereas the rhyme scheme is progressing all the way through here, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, it ends, also typical of many sonnets, in a rhymed couplet. Now, identifying rhyme scheme is a pretty basic requirement of any class that involves poetry. But more difficult is going to be trying to figure out why a poet would use a particular form and employ a particular rhyme scheme. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail because this is one of your discussion board questions, but one question worth asking is why McKay might gravitate towards a white Western European form when much of his poetry, including this poem, is a critique of that very culture. Why would he do that? What limitations does the sonnet form impose on him? But also, what are some of the advantages? What are some of the things that it opens up? Now, if we look at this poem, and I think it's worth noting, first of all, that it does not actually mention racial designations, and I believe McKay himself even said it doesn't necessarily have to be, talking about black suffering and white oppression, though it was commonly understood to mean that. And in fact, Claude McKay drew a whole lot of attention from the FBI because of his poetry. And as we'll see later on, lots of the black artists, probably most of the black artists that we're going to study, were constantly surveilled and harassed by law enforcement. In the case of McKay, he was originally born in Jamaica in the mid-1920s. Because of law enforcement pressure, he was actually kept out of the United States and forced to sort of travel abroad because he was seen as subversive, thanks in part to poems like this. Now, looking at it from a formal perspective, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to point out just a few characteristics in addition to the rhyme scheme. And you can see right away in the title that If We Must Die, this is a poem that from the outset makes it clear that whatever resistance the speaker is talking about is ultimately probably going to be futile, right? You're going to fight back, but you're also probably going to lose. And we see this in a number of ways. The poem's sort of playing with this in a number of ways. I mean, the first is simply the repetition of words that emphasize confinement or containment. And I've highlighted a few of them here. One of these, open grave, is almost kind of almost oxymoronic in a sense. The openness suggesting possibilities, but the grave not only speaking to the gravity of the content, but also to death and to the sort of enclosed earth around the body. But I've highlighted others being pressed to the wall, round a spot. I'm particularly drawn to penned because we think of that, of course, as being penned in, and there are a couple of places where he uses animal metaphors, and I want you to think about what that sort of dehumanization of this struggle suggests. But also penned, I think it's also kind of an allusion to the status of the writer, the person penning the poem. In the case of McKay and many of the black artists before and after him, penning a poem like this could get you stuck in an inglorious spot. It could get you pressed to the wall because this kind of subversive poem, again, was often not going to be tolerated by the white establishment. That's going to be a recurring theme in this class. Other things that are worth sort of noting about the poem, and I don't want to spend a lot of time, again, on the sonnet form because it's something that I'm going to ask you to consider, but two things. One is that I want you to think about why it emphasizes repetition and how it does that. Rhyme scheme is one way. The repetition of these certain containment, these word choices that suggest containment, that's another way that it uses repetition. But I want you to look for others. But I also want you to notice that if what the poem is about, and this is just one characteristic, if what the poem is about the attacking force being superior, in other words, suggesting that blacks resist, but also acknowledging that they're going to lose, notice that the second to last line is actually the longest line in the entire poem. And that's the line that actually describes the murderous, cowardly pack. And by giving that cowardly pack the longest line, even if after the final line says we're fighting back, this line right here actually overshadows this line. That's one small example, and you're going to see this everywhere. Langston Hughes does it. A lot of the poets that we're even reading this week do it. Using line length, the length of the line here suggesting the strength of the opposition, even to the point where it's going to overshadow whatever resistance is going to be offered. That is a common technique in not just African American poetry, but poetry. And I want you to be aware of the length of lines and the shapes of poems. Another thing I'll note is this rhyme scheme in and of itself. If one of the things that we're talking about here, and one of the things that the poem is about resistance, but also the futility of resistance, notice how the rhyme scheme advances, it goes from A to B to C to D to E to F, but then with this couplet gets stuck at G. In a way, I think that repetition, but also that sense of no more forward movement being stuck in G, that itself can be thought of as a reinforcement of what the poem is about. It's about fighting back, it's about trying to gain ground, but in the end, it's about being stuck and ultimately losing. And again, this is how rhyme scheme can be used to reinforce the content of the poem. One of your discussion board items is called form and content. And I want you to think about how a poem is written, the way that it's written, word choices, structure, rhyme scheme, line length, all of these things. You'll see people like Langston Hughes play with this a lot. How all of these things actually are being used to reinforce what the poem is about. Now, in just about 10 minutes, I've done this poem an injustice, given how important it's been to African American literature, but also to literary tradition generally. I mean, Winston Churchill is said to have spoken this I believe it was the House of Commons in World War II to sort of rally the troops and gain support in the war. It's been a hugely influential poem, but what I'm using it for here is to look at structural elements, and I hope this brief discussion has at least given you some idea of the kinds of ways that you can read these poems, aside from just thinking of them thematically. I hope you enjoyed the rest of McKay and the rest of the works from this week.